All right, I am recording with Dr. Eric from Ches. How do you say your
It's French. It's the worst marketing thing I've ever sponsored. It's Chez Eric at Eric's home. Yeah.
All right, Shay Eric, and he's got a cool YouTube channel that I've been following for a while, and this is now his third time on the podcast, so we're happy to have him here. He is a psychiatrist in New York City practicing, and he also has a background in religion. So his studies align very well with ours. And his background is not specifically Jungian, which is what we kind of are studying in this series of this Jung's Map of the Soul. But this is the first chapter, which is on the ego, which is something that anyone and everyone has to deal with, including him and his background. And he had read this chapter. So I really want to get his perspective on this. And Eric, tell us what's going on with you and how you've been and what's going on with your channel a little bit, and then we'll dive into it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. When you said third time, I realized, yeah, it is the third time.
Yeah.
So we're getting a little bit of a series. We're gonna make
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. And it's really cool. My channel is Chez Eric Psychiatry, Religion, and Life, PRL. CHEZERICPRL.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm building out content to talk about psychiatry and religion because I feel like that if you combine the two, you can really help improve your life. In particular, I have Chez Eric 3.0 coming out, which is focused on high performers who want to maintain a spiritual connection with a higher power. And I have a whole decked out thing where very long videos with all the fancy editing and all the music and stuff. And it's coming out this week, actually, the 27th. Very excited about it, but I'm also excited to talk about, the ego, because it is a topic that, a lot of people really misunderstand.
Right.
It's a topic that a lot of people think they know, but it's used so much in our lives that we kind of forget what it means, and understanding what it means can really help people.
Right. And actually, it's funny that you say it that way, because when I started this series last December, I skipped this chapter because it kind of just seemed like, well, I wasn't sure how much time I want to spend on the book. And it kind of seemed like it's one of those things that we can briefly talk about. But actually, as I decided to go into more and more of the chapters, then I realized, because of course the ego subject will keep coming up, and I realized, okay, that actually is the right place to start. So in the future, people who maybe find this series, start with chapter 1, which we'll talk about now, and then that'll give that good foundation of what that sort of ego point of reference is that we'll talk about for a little bit today. And then we get into all the other stuff that we did in the other chapters. So and before we really dive in, you said you had a little bit of a background with Carl Jung, but your background is more just your own religious background and psychiatry background. So I don't know if you can tell us a little bit about your background, and then also just how that aligns with Carl Jung and what you found in this chapter of how that kind of all flows together. I know that's a mouthful, but
oh geez, okay, yeah, sure. So my background,
you running into this chapter basically.
Yeah, okay, sure. So my perspective is from a psychiatrist perspective.
Right.
My background is fairly, I guess you could call it eclectic, or kind of ridiculous. In undergraduate, I studied accounting, and then I passed the CPA examination. And then I went to a pre-med post-bac program at Columbia University. I studied sciences, and then I applied for medical school, but I also applied for MD-JD programs, dual degree programs. So I ended up only getting accepted to the MD-JD program at the University of Illinois. So I ended up going to law school and medical school. And I go to law school, and then I passed the bar exam.
So you're like an accountant, doctor, lawyer.
Yeah, you're looking at the most stereotypical Asian that could exist.
All right.
And then I hated medical school with all the memorization, but I loved psychiatry. Because psychiatry allowed me to actually talk about the things that mattered to me. And I was fairly religious at the time. I guess you could call it, I guess I grew up Catholic, but not really. My Protestant defined Catholics as a Christian who doesn't read the Bible. So he
Okay.
basically, as growing up, he's like, I'm gonna like teach you the Bible in dinner. Don't read it. And then I literally know all the stories in the Bible through what my dad taught me. And
Interesting.
then I went to the Catholic church there, but then I was a little bit they didn't have a very good graduate program fellowship there, I would say. So I had to transition to a charismatic branch, and
Mm.
then I was a little bit. It was interesting, and then I transitioned to another Protestant branch and a whole different sort of experience with Christianity. But what I found is that psychiatry really sheds a lot of light
Mhm.
into understanding ourselves and consequently understanding our relationship with God.
Right.
Because if you have your own biases that interfere with your interpretation of, say, the Bible or religious texts or your interaction with God, you're going to run into a lot of problems. And studying like psychology and ego and stuff like that, a lot of it
Mm.
came from having good friends in the field or of also philosophy. So he was an individual, a good friend of mine. He's good proponent of Heidegger,
Yeah.
right? But in part of this, Jung is a very classic book that or concept that we would read about. So it always would be on the side,
Mm.
like in a textbook. So it would be derived. It would be like a derivative of his actual works.
Mm.
In particular, starting the YouTube channel, I wanted to talk about the most pivotal works
Mhm.
that dealt with religion and psychiatry. The first being Freud, The Future of an Illusion, and
Right.
the second one being William James,
Mhm.
Varieties of Religious Experience.
Which you
And
just
I
finished today, by the way.
just finished today. Holy, well, I don't know
Yeah.
if I
Yeah.
should say the C word, but
On your channel.
holy, yeah,
Mhm.
it was huge. I did not realize, but it was very, very informative.
Right. Right.
And Jung is a very, very influential character in the history of psychology and psychiatry. I had a friend of mine who was a psychology PhD, and he studied personalities. And
Right.
he talked about how he didn't like Jung because of it was proved wrong or whatever.
Mhm.
But the reality is that he's been very influential
Right.
in
Right.
how we understand people and how we think, and whether or not the personality components are uh, just a fleeting issue or
Mhm.
something that's actually integral to who we are.
Mhm.
It is something worth understanding about people, right?
Right.
Extroversion, introversion, stuff like that.
Right.
So in
Right.
particular, the ego, I mean, like Freud talks about the ego, Jung deserves to talk about the ego, but the ego is something that's very, very important to understand if we really want to have an understanding of ourselves.
And all right. So yeah. Well, I guess we'll just dive in. And I don't the because there is this issue that it's often misunderstood what the ego is. Maybe
Mhm.
we should start there so then we don't get stuck on that
Yeah,
later,
sure.
which is a little bit of
Yeah,
what people think the ego is,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then we can start into what it actually is. So
yeah,
what do you say that
yeah.
people confuse it with,
Mhm.
and then starting it to get into what it
Mhm.
actually is?
When people say ego, they
Right.
typically are talking about a big ego. You
Yeah.
have an ego, you have a big ego. And as a result, people try to say, okay, I want to eliminate my ego. I want to put my
Hmm.
ego out of it. But in actuality, the way it's properly used is that ego is really a sense of yourself, your identity. And I'll get
Hmm.
to the more specific thing later.
Hmm.
But to say ego is simply something that's your pride or sort of a form of arrogance is a bit incorrect.
Right.
Because if you were to work on then eliminating your pride or arrogance, then you would be you'd be okay, but you
Hmm.
would still need to replace it with something else, a concept of yourself, a sense of
Hmm.
yourself.
Hmm.
And in particular, ego rests, according to Freud, ego rests within the relationship between the superego and the id.
Right.
The superego being the moral center and the id being what we want. So
Hmm.
it's kind of like the id says, I want to eat.
Hmm.
The superego says, oh, you can't like, shove a burger in your face so fast, right?
Yeah.
And then the ego says, okay, go to McDonald's, buy a burger, eat the burger appropriately. It mediates between the superego and the ego. So sorry, it mediates between the superego and the id to do things appropriately. And as a result, it becomes your identity. That would be Freud's conception of it. Jung has a more interesting layout and
Hmm.
interesting map
Right.
of how he would view the ego,
Hmm.
which a lot of Jung's material isn't
Hmm.
directly testable. So that's where he gets his most criticism. Like we can't test, okay, where's the ego? We don't have like a needle to like measure the voltage of the ego.
Right.
but it does offer interesting insights. And if we could frame a way to view the world from it, then all the better.
Right. Yeah. It's I mean, this is so much of what psychology or psychiatry, the issue of it is because it's a subjective experience. And I was almost thinking of, and that gets into another similar issue. Well, there's a lot you said there, so
Yeah,
let me, I
let's
guess,
unpack it.
yeah, one at a time. So there is an issue, and I don't remember if that he mentioned it much in this chapter, Dr. Murray Stein, um, but it's Jung calls it ego inflation.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, that's when someone gets a overly high sense of their own identity.
Mm-hmm.
You might get into, which is more of like an Adler thing or and somewhat Nietzsche thing of the power drives of like a superiority or inferiority complex,
Mm-hmm.
which is to put your individual self artificially higher and then sometimes even artificially lower in the world. But what that actually is, it's not the ego itself per se that's part of its makeup or what it is, but it is actually the, what would you say, it's a characteristic of it. Like, okay, in this chapter he says there's sort of two ego personalities,
Mm-hmm.
and Jung sometimes called them one and two. So one, I think, was the innate ego that's in every person, and to some degree even in newborn babies, to some degree even in animals on a lesser degree because they have a low level of self-consciousness. But as you build up your level of individual consciousness, you develop your ego, but then it sort of enwraps itself in what he calls personality two, which is sort of your individual personal ego, non-universal, in that it gets this idea of what I as an individual am, that I whatever that I believe that my identity is, including name, date of birth, all these things. So that's like the other type of ego. So in other words, we all have a individual universal ego, and then we get our sort of identity layered on top of that, and that goes through its maturation process throughout life. And then sort of the other controversial thing on top of that people I think often get confused about too, that we've talked about a little bit, is having a weak ego versus a strong ego, because you actually want to have a strong ego but not an inflated ego. And then
Mm-hmm.
also similarly, sometimes we talk about ego death,
Mm-hmm.
and which is tough because you don't want to not have an ego, but the only reason ego death kind of works as a concept and somewhat religious in it's like an Eastern religious thing, and somewhat in our Western sort of Christian background, we might call that the repentance process, but
Mm-hmm.
where we basically kill that identified ego, but it's almost immediately is brought back, but in a more mature way.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think of that as far as starting to unpack the confusing things about ego?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, you see, what's interesting about what Jung is talking about ego is that he talks about it in terms of its interaction with the other parts of the, I would say, conscious and
Right.
also the subconscious elements of the psychological um, field, right?
Right.
That's what
Right.
we're trying to get at. And
Right.
he talked about, we're talking about consciousness, what we're aware of, and he says the
Mm-hmm.
ego can actually travel about here and there.
Right. Right.
Um, when it comes to this idea of ego dying and then reincarnating, I suppose, or coming back and more mature, it sounds very similar to what William James talks about with the
Mm-hmm.
idea of surrender. That
Right.
when you surrender yourself to the higher power, it creates a state of a religious sort of happiness or connection. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting because we have this concept of ego, and the way that Jung talks about it almost sounds very similar to this idea of a soul. right?
Yeah.
That there's a distinct element that an individual is in control of and is aware of. And it's almost as if it is separate from the very subconscious that makes up what we do, such that we can interact with it independently of that subconscious and discover more within the subconscious as we please.
So complexes were an issue with Carl Jung, as well as Freud and others at the time, and some have dealt with them all the way up until now. And sometimes Carl Jung will say, and some may or may not agree with this, and so it'd be interesting to hear your perspective, is that the ego is one of the main complexes. Not in the way that we talk about like a mother complex or father complex, definitely not like an inferiority superiority complex, but it is this psychological, it's almost like a psychological naturally developed construct in a way, and as it develops it becomes this thing because naturally our minds or souls develop these divisions, and everyone, depending on somewhat their genetic background and then their environment growing up and their development, is going to develop a little bit different. But the reason that we speak in these terms is because so much of this is universal, including for this foundation here, that we all develop an ego sort of constructed over time. It's very almost non-existent at birth, and then by over the coming decades it becomes stronger and stronger, and you want it to develop in a certain way that's more healthy, and somewhat interacting with a person's internal world as well as the outer world. And then also on this line, now I forget the exact word that he uses, but it has to do with conflict, that we have internal conflicts and external conflicts, or subjective and objective conflicts, and how that we have and we actually want those. We want those conflicts because it's almost like physical exercise. You don't want to be like a lazy person that sits around all day, or you get out of shape and everything else. Same thing with the ego. You want it to go through conflicts almost every day throughout life, but not super overwhelming conflicts like major trauma, or that will lead to a maladapted ego and internal life usually. But so you want it to have a balance, not no conflicts or very few conflicts, but not too much or traumatizing. So again, I know that's a lot, but it's so basically that's saying it is a psychological construct that's developed over time. And so what's your perspective on the ego as a complex that's developed throughout a person's life?
Yeah. So this is where I think psychiatry is slightly different from psychology, and or at least the theoretical parts of psychology and philosophy as well, right? We have an idea of the ego being a complex.
Right.
But then if I'm going to be a clinician and I have a patient in front of me, the only thing I really care about is how do I get this patient better?
Right.
That's kind of my role and my job. As far as the complex is able to describe a greater state of reality, then it's very helpful for me to then know what to do next, know what to say next. And the ego having a complex and having all these moving parts, and then it interacts with certain conflicts of internal versus external, that's all very, very helpful. But the truth is that I could probably create another equally valid theoretical framework using slightly different terminology that can still have empirical justification in some shape or form. Right?
Sure.
So in terms of like whether or not the ego is a complex versus another complex versus another complex, this was Freud and Jung and all these, not ancient philosophy, like a older
foundational
psychologists. They were really trying to understand the human mind because they recognized that it wasn't doing what we would predict if everything was rational, and that there really was mental health issues that everyone was just trying to figure out. They really had no clue at the time of all these mental health issues at all. And in that process, they were always trying to search for some sort of universal application, but there wasn't really that much quote unquote funding for this stuff because they just had their clients, they had their people, and they wrote stuff out and their theories along the way. So as far as the complex idea, I can agree that it is a complex. I can agree that there are other complexes as well. I prefer the relationship. The ego is always in a relationship with something else.
Right.
It's rarely doing anything by itself. For Freud, it's interacting with the id and superego. For Jung, it is traveling all across the psyche for conscious and subconscious, and has the ability to interact with other things as well. But the ego is always interacting. It's that interaction that becomes very interesting, not the whatever state the ego itself is.
So when you say that, it brings up an interesting point that I was discussing recently. And I know some psychologists have made a similar point. I don't know the exact terminology, but that a lot of the world's psychological problems, or that what we think or call psychological treat as psychological problems, are really complexity problems. And when I say complexity, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as complex, although these complexes that are more in chapter 2 of this book, they do what that they are is that our internal minds and souls, and our mental life is very complicated. And so a lot of what you do in psychology and psychiatric counseling is to help them order that internal world, and then also order the external world. Like a person might need to figure out, like, oh, my life isn't going well, and it might just be something as simple as they need to get a different job, but doing so is also not as simple as maybe it was when we were hunter-gatherer or when we were farmers, and it's just a matter of like changing your physical area. Maybe you need to go back to school. So it's like these complexity issues. So I'm especially interested in that concept from you, because you are in a psychiatric background, in that I'm sure you've seen times when these issues are psychiatric and maybe even some kind of a mental disorder, even at the chemical level. And then other times when there's nothing going on. And I think we talked about this maybe on our first podcast a little bit, where there's nothing going on the chemical level, but they just need to change some things in their lives. So what's your take on that?
So in this particular space, I like to start with a story I had with one of my attendings in my class. And he said that, taking medications and going to therapy are the same thing when we're getting to depression. And I raised the objection, like, really, like the same thing? I would think that they're both different, because one is a pill and the other one forces you to reflect on yourself and gain greater awareness and knowledge of your circumstances and how to get out of it. They seem two very different things. But he said that all things that people do always goes back to the brain. The brain did something to make you do what you do. Therefore, the chemical change that you make, the electrical change you make, whatever change you make in the brain is the same thing, whether it's through a pill or through a talking to somebody.
Right.
I was taken aback, but I respected his opinion, and I realized that is actually the belief and the I would say the good faith belief of a lot of neuroscientists out there, and psychiatrists, and even some psychologists, that it all comes from the brain, and that the neurochemicals tell you everything you need to know. We just need to learn more. What we found is that we're not there yet, but we're getting closer here and there. Now, when it comes to this idea of most psychiatric issues this, most psychiatric issues that, I think that we have to really separate this. Well, first we have to let go of this idea called normalcy. And the DSM does this pretty well. At least it should, right? That we're not looking about what's normal, what's not normal. Or actually, for the DSM, we're just looking at functioning. Right. Functioning well. Right. So when someone passes away, the functioning thing to do would be to mourn that loss. Some people wouldn't mourn the loss. Other people would mourn it to the extent that they might want to commit suicide. And the question is it appropriate to give someone medications in one or more of these scenarios? Right. And the answer is the DSM changed their mind a couple of times. Okay. And in that space, you begin to realize that this is why I love psychiatry. It touches into this concept of what does it mean to be a person?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have free will?
Mhm.
And when we talk about psychiatric illnesses, it really becomes this concept of my life isn't working. The answer might be a medication. Let's turn it into psychiatry.
Mhm.
Because prior to a medication being the answer, we kind of just worked with, like prior to Freud, for example, what
Right.
did you do? You talked to your family, you talked to a priest maybe, right? You shoved the bipolar and the psychotic patients in asylums and called
Yeah.
it a day. But
Yeah.
nowadays we find that I don't think that, let's say, schizophrenia is a psychological issue, nor is
Mm.
bipolar. But I do find that a lot of people have reported that antidepressants have truly helped with their depression and
Yeah.
anxiety, and it does exist. Now, if everything can be accomplished, sure. Um, but I do think that everybody has a story of their lives. But I think that most people don't get a chance to share that story with the people that are closest to them. And I think that because everybody has a story and we build our perception of the world through stories, we then therefore have a very powerful tool within Jung's ego, discussion to understand this story methodology that humans have a tendency to gravitate towards.
Well, yeah, because basically there's three things to order. Okay, so I was reading again a little bit ago. What was his name? Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah, yes, I read that one too. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Book.
he made a really interesting point in there, and kind of to what I was saying a couple minutes ago, where uh, he calls his therapy like the second Viennese school, logotherapy, or
Yeah, yeah.
all about like existentialism and adding
Mhm.
meaning to life and finding meaning. Um, and he gave this example in the book of, and I think this is in part 2 of the book. It's a kind of short 2-part book, but and this is where he's talking more about like what his thing logotherapy is. The first part's talking about surviving the German concentration camps.
Yeah, the
So
first
it's
one.
a very inspirational story, showing that anybody can get through anything, or maybe not. Maybe that's a little overgeneralizing, but
Yeah.
anyway. But he makes the point that there was one of his clients or patients, whatever you call him, was having this issue where for the past few years they were seeing some other, maybe Freudian or whoever at the time, going through psychoanalysts, and then this guy, he just had a job that he hated and a job that he really wanted to get into.
Mhm.
uh and that was the real problem. But in his psychoanalyst background that he was going through for like something like 3 or 4 years or whatever, they were just doing all this like symbolic stuff of like, oh, all this means this and this means this and this means this, and maybe that was true, but he wasn't actually doing the outside things that were the right thing to do for him. So in this example that he gave, the guy just kind of like changed careers and everything went better for him in his life.
Mhm.
Now, so sometimes I would think, okay, that's great, but it's almost like you can oversimplify with that point of view too, because so basically we're three things in this understanding, and
Mhm.
this will get back into ego here in a second, but in that we are our internal selves, and sometimes that gets discombobulated and overly complicated, or we get lost in our internal selves, and that's why we can sort that out through therapy. And we are also we're chemical organisms, and we're
Mhm.
also what we do externally.
Mhm.
And if a person only does one or two of those things, it's fine, and maybe the other will catch up later. But ultimately, for the efficacy that we're looking for in anyone's life, at some point they need to have all three worked out as much as they can. And sometimes that might mean pills, that might just mean change in diet or sleep or exercise on the
Mhm.
physical level. And then some of that might mean therapy or just reading or better relationships on the internal level. And then on the external level, it might mean uh, being a more responsible adult or whatever the case is. So I don't know. What do you think of that? And this starts to tie back into, I think, how that we look at ourselves in all of this, in our ego identification and our sort of responsibility that we take on every level too.
Yeah, so I think that the world is beginning to recognize that
Mm-hmm.
the person
Mm-hmm.
is a mixed story.
Right, right,
There's
right.
a biological component to it. There's a psychological component to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about the 5 parts of a person:
Yeah.
biological, psychological, emotional, existential, and spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And having things run really well in unison is very important for a fulfilling life.
Right,
And
right,
that
right.
can only gain through clarity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the way the ego works with all of this is
Right.
that it is the psychological component which
Mm-hmm.
has the ability to perceive all of the
Right.
others and to understand all of the others. But it doesn't seem to have any goal in particular, except
Mm-hmm.
for the one that you want or you choose. It doesn't
Right.
seem to be there doesn't seem to be any real driving force. For example, a biological driving force would be to poop or to
Yeah.
pee or to eat, right?
Yeah.
That's a driving force. Whereas an existential driving force would be to grow, and a spiritual driving
Mm-hmm.
force would be to be connected with a higher power.
Right.
An emotional driving force would be to, well, feel the emotion and do something about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But with the ego, the driving force seems to be yours or whatever you want to do, or whatever
Mm-hmm.
you choose to do, or something to that extent. And this is
Mm-hmm.
where I guess Frankel's logotherapy comes into play,
Right.
where he's talking about meaning and how we need meaning, and then perhaps relates that to the ego overall.
Right. And this kind of gets into so sort of back on the issue of like personality one, personality two. So there's our universal ego, and then the ego that we build up over time.
Mm-hmm.
So the universal ego is it's a so the other thing that we get into later in the chapters is how that there's these stages of life, and our sort of early stages of life, we are one way as a child. And if that happens normally, basically we have our pinnacle of ego development sometime in middle age, and then we have to go through those transitions of properly becoming a person past middle age. And so a lot of what that is it's building up the ego to its pinnacle sometime maybe in the 30s or 40s of an individual's life. And then it kind of if the person is properly going into their second half of life, then they kind of become more like that uh, universal ego again, or even childlike in a way, maybe discover the inner child, so to speak. Um, so so yeah, basically it builds up over time, that has to properly break down, because otherwise, and it's something we talk about in the later chapters of the book, is how or I think mostly in the individuation chapter, where if you don't go through those stages properly, then that's how you have people who, you look at some people and they are genius, wise old people, and other people are just like grumpy old men or whatever, So this ego has its stages of life too. So I don't that didn't really get into that chapter, but I'm wondering what you think of that as far as like a ego's development and its place in the world throughout the stages of life.
Yeah. So a lot of the psychologists, like Erickson, has his stages of life, right?
Right, right.
I guess you mentioned Jung had some issues of stage of life, and
Yeah,
we have was it Ainsworth? I think Ainsworth also talked about development overall.
yeah.
But prior to the modern conception of child development,
Mm-hmm.
people believed that children were just little humans, like little adults, right? They didn't
Yeah.
really believe that children were growing overall and that things were
Mm.
developing over time. So we only really learned about, I guess, development in the past 100, 200 years or so.
Yeah.
And prior to that, I guess we just didn't really know. And yes, the ego is going to develop, it's going to change over time.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is dependent on what it experiences, what the person experiences in their
Mm-hmm.
lifetime. And the key part, remember you were talking about before about conflict, right? That you
Yeah.
always need conflict. I would say that conflict is the result of you interacting with reality. And
Mm-hmm.
that when your belief system is contrary to reality, you are then forced to reconcile the two. And the
Right.
more conflict you have, the more you are likely to reconcile towards an understanding of reality. And therefore, you can live a more fulfilling life because you can make high quality decisions based on reality as opposed to based on a delusion or an illusion or a bias or something like that.
Yeah, well, and it's something we touched on for a minute, but I'm also wondering what you think about and how do we try to find that balance? Because like I said, on one hand, we don't want to overly seek out confident or overly seek out conflict. And on the other hand, we don't want to overly avoid it. And also we have to be careful because sometimes people go through very traumatic situations, and that can lead to all kinds of issues. So and we talked about, you know, children and people at all different stages in life. So definitely, like, raising a child, you want to make sure that they have a healthy amount of conflict, but not too much. And then also then raising yourself as an adult, becoming a more integrated adult or whatever, is you want to find that healthy amount of conflict, but not too much. So I don't know if there's any sort of rules of thumb in your experience of how to find that balance of the right amount of conflict.
So this is why I don't like ego as defined as a boastful thing.
Yeah.
I like ego more as just it exists and it is yourself, and you then have to explore things along the way. I personally have found that for as long as you identify yourself, your sense of self, as a series of characteristics, you will always be apt to defend those characteristics at the cost of reality, right? Or potentially at the cost of reality. However, if you instead, you define your ego based on a process, then as long as the process has some elements of the scientific method, then you will always be able to alter your understanding of the world, but you don't have to have significant conflicts within your ego. So for example, let's say I'm trying to think of a good example, because this is the first time this is a question you raised. I understand the answer, but I haven't really fleshed it out. It's kind of like, let's say you want to go to school. You want to go to a good college, right?
Right. Okay.
And you want to brag to all your friends that you went to a really good college. And if you don't go to the college, you're going to be really sad, right?
Right.
That is you ascribing a particular characteristic of acceptance from a college to your ego. And for as long as you went to a good one, you'll be happy. You went to a bad one, you're unhappy. Or if you go to a not so good one, you'll convince yourself that it's a good one, and then you'll be happy, right?
Yeah. Well, and a lot of this issue has to do with it's almost and don't completely lose your story, but it has to do with it's almost like people in relationships, you know, like even, you know, intimate relationships, marriages, they will sometimes get in abusive relationships or relationships where they're treated badly, and this is often the case, and I'm sure you've seen in your experience, because they have a low self-worth or self-identity. And then other people, they will have other issues because they have like not like they're have too big of an ego, but you might say an inflated ego or an inflated self-identity, where and then that goes like through every aspect of the relationship. They can never accept that a person's nice to them, and that's why they'll always like seek out bad partners or whatever. And then the other hand, maybe a person will be too identified as maybe even a little bit narcissistic, and then they won't be able to get a good partner because like no one's perfect enough for them. So you've got to find that balance, and I think that ties into what you're talking about with school and everything else in life. You've got to find that balance of being a little bit humble, but also understanding what your place is in the world.
But it's not really a balance, because with the school situation, I would propose that the healthy way to go about it is to instead of seeing it as a good school as a medal to hold on to or a trophy, instead the trophy is the process. That you're a hard worker, that you try your best, and you allow things to shake out. And if your ego is founded on the process, that is a much healthier way to go about it than any particular emblem or trophy or medal. When it comes to the abusive person situation, let me ask you this question.
Sure.
Does someone with a narcissistic personality have a high ego or a low ego? A good sense of self or a poor sense of self?
So that's an interesting question. Uh, from the outside, objectively, it looks like they have a high sense of self because that's the way they present
Mhm,
themselves. But it's actually the opposite in that
mhm,
they
mhm,
have such a low sense of self that they
mhm.
need to put out this facade
Exactly,
or
exactly.
this fake image of a super high sense of self, and
Mhm,
that's why that they're so
yeah,
they're so sensitive, and they
mhm,
need a constant. And that's why narcissistic people often are um, good leaders, like even you might say Stalin or Hitler, for example. Not that I like exalt
good
them as
leader.
good leaders, but they were leaders in the sense that they were able to get a lot of people to follow them. But the
Yeah.
reason is, and it's kind of interesting at them as as examples, because they built up these facades in the external world that then people could identify with and follow.
Mhm,
So
mhm. Yeah.
but I
So
think it's
so
because they actually had low self-worth, and then they attached that to their nation that was then able to be built up. But
yeah,
yeah, so to your thing of
yeah,
what a narcissistic person is, it's the opposite, but it looks like
yeah.
high self-worth on the outside.
And this is what happens when you try to do, let's say you try to do psychology with just one course in psychology, right? You
Yeah,
only have
yeah.
one tool, which is the ego, and then you
Right.
try to fit it to all these scenarios, but there's
Mhm.
actually a lot more going on. And for example,
Right.
the person who is getting abused by somebody else, whether they're male or female,
Right.
it's not so much they have a low ego, that's certainly a component, right?
Mhm.
But another major component is that if in fact they had that experience
Mhm.
with another figure, like a
Mhm.
parental figure,
Right.
mother or father figure, then
Mhm.
what ends up happening is that they begin to believe that this dynamic is the norm, that the abuse is part of the norm,
Right.
that they begin to feel like that it was their fault that they were abused. It's not the other person's fault. Like, oh, they yelled at me because I wasn't perfect. They
Right.
yelled at me because I didn't do the right thing. But
Mhm.
if I do the right thing, if I'm perfect, then they won't yell at me anymore.
Mhm.
And that's the way they resolve. That's the way the ego resolves it. But
Right.
it's not. I wouldn't say it's a. There's certainly an impaired ego, but it's
Mhm.
not like, oh, ho hum, I'm a piece of shit.
Yeah, yeah.
I like, I therefore should have an abusive, partner.
Mhm.
It's more like I believe I'm used to this um, scenario. I am used to this social dynamic, and because I'm comfortable in the social dynamic, I allow it
Right.
to continue, and it is all I know.
Yeah, well, it's kind of we identify with certain roles, like life kind of plays out as a drama and we're kind of unconscious of it, but we identify as like I should always be this kind of role in life and I should always be in this, and we may
Mhm,
not be unconscious of these decisions a lot of times, but we identify as these things. And so then it's like if you are accepted at a really good school but you don't believe you should be, or you you know a really great person wants to have a relationship with you on whatever
mhm,
level, but you're like, oh no, that's not me. uh However, that's a person. um we might say that they have a weak ego and that they need to go through the process of developing that to
mhm,
where they don't have an inflated ego later, but they have a healthy, mature ego later. And then
mhm,
they understand we're all just people, and it's great if you can have relationships with great people, and it's great if you can get into great schools if possible, then do it. But it's just a process to do so. So
mhm.
it's that's why it's like a maturation process. Like our any of these things are never one thing. They're processes that are kind of like maturing and evolving.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So when we use ego in this way, it
mhm,
becomes
yeah.
very similar to this idea of self-confidence.
Yeah.
However, I believe that self-confidence is only a portion of what we mean by ego.
Right.
Right? Ego is much more dynamic and much more, a much larger concept in the psychological space than simply mere self-confidence. Although
Mhm.
self-confidence is certainly important, and
Mhm.
low ego, high egos. It really is, the ego itself is really meant to represent our sense of ourselves as
Right.
distinct from the things we discover about ourselves we didn't realize. And
Mhm.
that's the peculiar part, that we can actually discover aspects of ourselves by self-reflection that we
Mhm.
didn't previously know, which indicates on, let's say, you can say at an empirical level, that there's something distinct between our sense of ourself and our actual subconscious or conscious psyche, if we can actually discover new things about ourselves by mere reflection.
Yeah, reflection, and which sometimes in this book, the author calls it the ego is a reflection of the totality of consciousness, and sometimes that is what Jung calls the self. And so I'm wondering what you think of it in that perspective, is that it's like a reflection of what all consciousness is, but it's kind of like enwrapped in our individual standpoint.
So this is where it gets really challenging.
Yeah.
When I was younger, I think in high schoolish, I recognized that there's something very concerning about the idea of analyzing your own thoughts.
Yeah.
And it's that if you are a small fish, you can float around the water and you can pretty much understand the current and which way it's going because you're small.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a giant whale, your very movement moves the current itself. So it's very hard for you to know what movements the water is because you're the giant whale.
Right.
With our thoughts, it's very challenging for us to observe our thoughts because the very thought is the very thought that we're trying to observe.
Right.
This is why I love psychiatry plus religion. Because when we interact with this concept of a higher power, it almost creates a third person to then reflect onto ourselves what things could potentially be, which is distinct from, I guess, theoretically the ego. And then we can have some sort of third person reflective dynamic that the ego by itself would not theoretically be able to access. Although you could always say everything's in the mind, just like everything is chemical, everything's biological, right? And we get into this weird sort of space. But when we're talking about whether ego is reflective versus not, I would say I'm not sure. And we get into a very complex situation. But I escape by simply saying, okay, God exists. Let me ask God in the prayer. And then I then reflect on the Bible, for example, to reflect on myself. And in that dynamic, I'm able to uncover certain aspects of myself that becomes useful, whether or not the ego is reflective versus inclusive versus other concepts.
Well, and what this starts to get into is just the aspect of consciousness and unconsciousness, because we can only there's only so much that consciousness can be. Like we can only have so much in our conscious mind. Sometimes it's analogous to like light and darkness. So in your light, what you have in the lit of your what you know or you're aware of, your what's illuminated is conscious. Although this is like another aspect to what the ego is that is a little tricky, because like I could say like I'm aware and conscious of like all the things that I own and all the like, and I can like they're like in my like all the things that I know and things like maybe 10,000 things about like myself and my life, or things that I read or whatever might be like within that light. Like let's say that like my consciousness is a room, so to speak, and it's a lit room, and in that there's like thousands of things, but my ego consciousness is somewhat more isolated than that, and that it's basically just one thing at a time. And so I can only like pull up one memory at a time, or maybe they're one is a little bit too generalized, but I can tie together just a handful of things at once. And that's kind of how ego consciousness works. Whereas below that, like what's outside of the room of consciousness, or outside of the room of or into the unconscious realm, there's like trillions of things and infinite things, and we can see the effects of them, and we can theorize what all is outside there, and we can expand our conscious world into what's in it, is what's included there. But then the unconscious world is much bigger, and as we mature, we better understand how to deal with what's conscious and what's unconscious, because a lot of what a person's maturity and health is the ability to deal with the unknown and the greater world than just what they're familiar with. So that's another whole aspect, and I'm wondering what you think of that as you got into this book and everything, or this chapter, as far as it's these things that we've talked about, but also it's just this like kind of like pinpoint vantage point of what consciousness is.
The traditional model is the iceberg model,
Yeah.
where consciousness is the ice that you see above the iceberg, you see above the water,
Right.
and the subconscious is the 90% you see underneath the water.
Right.
And that's the traditional way we do it. And again, we do have limited minds, limited perspectives, so we can only really handle one thing at a time, thing at a time. Whereas everything kind of works in the background.
Right.
So yeah, it's a very, very known quality of our sense of ourselves, our ego, and our psychology.
Well, and this gets into, he didn't talk a lot about in this chapter, but to make so much of our lives workable, it's like a working drama, working dream, working theory, you might even say. Like I was thinking of it almost, and how that like sometimes we'll see these pictures of our whole universe. And of course we've never gotten a camera out to the farthest reachings of the universe to take a picture and send us back that picture. That's a theoretical model that we've been able to kind of like put together in a computer simulation, and then we can look at it with our sort of like I-ness, our sort of individual consciousness, and say, yeah, that makes sense. But it only makes sense because of all the theory that went into it to draw out that theory, and then look at it from that perspective of the picture and say, yep, that makes sense of what the universe would look like from that outside perspective. And same thing when we like put together these pictures of the mind that we can't really observe objectively like that, and we put together these pictures of so many things. It's we because our ego consciousness can only do so much at a time. That's why we have to do so much with working theories like this. So
yeah. So at the end, with all the working theories, I always have to fall down to my patient's there. What do I do for them?
Right.
And as long as the working theory gives me the ability to gain insight on how to interact with them in a positive way, I'm all for it. If the theory becomes too esoteric that I can't really use it, then it's nice to know.
Right.
But I'm going to have to kind of move on from there. That's always been my general stance on things, largely because that's how I was trained as a clinician.
Right. What was it say? Oh, the other issue that they didn't get into a lot in this chapter, he mentioned it a couple times, and I want to get your perspective on it too, is this issue of disassociation, which is something I've read about more in another book recently, but that sometimes in ego development, we'll say, and it's especially issue for those who have been through too much conflict, or you probably even say trauma, where they overly disassociate. So some disassociation, and they mentioned a little bit in this chapter, like I said, is good and healthy and responsible. And sometimes like even Viktor Frankl, who we've mentioned, I've heard other stories of people who went through POW situations or whatever. They go through intentional disassociative acts to survive major traumatic events, and that's how they're able to do it. So there's a good dissociation sometimes, so that a trauma doesn't overwhelm, but if we're not careful, we can become too disassociated, and that's how sometimes our egos will become too isolated. So I don't know, what do you think about that aspect of controlling how that we associate and disassociate with the psychological environment?
Yeah. So typically, well, dissociation is one of the more challenging symptoms that I personally have seen in practice and whatnot.
Yeah.
Largely because one, it deals with trauma, which is always fairly challenging, and two, since they're dissociating, it's hard to interact with them or for them to even remember or them to complain about.
Right.
And there really isn't any medication, so to speak, for dissociation. And even when you're going through therapy, since they've dissociated, it's hard to have a discussion about that particular item.
Right.
It's very, very challenging. Dissociating itself is a very challenging thing to understand and to sort of treat. But when it comes to its relationship with the ego, I think this is where we need a little bit more tools than just the ego to understand this relationship, because there seems to be a survival mechanism to it as well, as you alluded to, right?
Right.
Like somehow dissociating makes the emotional pain so
Yeah,
much.
it's like a innate pain management system that we've developed,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
if we're not careful, especially in the modern or postmodern world, it's kind of gone a little haywire when just about anything can be overly, overwhelming, too complicated, or seem maybe sometimes more traumatic than it is, or sometimes it really is super traumatic. And that's where psychiatry and psychology can come in and help put those associations back together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess what's, and since you have experience with this in your practice, how have you seen that affect ego development, and then how have you seen that challenge play out, and the way to kind of become properly associated again, or how to deal with not over disassociating like we
So
can do if we're not careful?
I would say that isolated dissociation isn't too common, especially let's say coming to the outpatient setting. Nobody comes in saying I'm dissociating.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. And very rarely people will say I come in and I used to dissociate. It's usually a family member talking about it. It's usually, someone else saying they just kind of blanked out. Or maybe someone does have sort of a gap in their memory they don't quite know. Very challenging. And actually ego development, it's more of because they don't really remember it, they're dissociated, it doesn't seem to impact the ego in the way, but I'm not too much of an expert in that because I don't have, because it's so rare, right? I won't have a lot of experience on it.
Yeah.
There are dissociative identity disorders, right? And there's a lot of books on it. My what's it called? It's called not mentor. My supervisor, my psychotherapy supervisor, actually wrote the book on multiple personality disorders because he had an individual who did switch personalities here and there. There are some people who believe that multiple personality disorders don't exist, but then there's some who say that it does. So it's actually quite a hotly debated topic in the world. I personally haven't had a patient with multiple personality disorder.
Yeah.
However, at the same time, if they did, then I wouldn't really know it if I only saw one of the personalities and not the other one, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's something that's a little bit challenging to experience in the field.
Yeah. I mean, to some degree, I don't know if you'd say it's theoretical or just a way of looking at it. It's like we can do it in our day-to-day life. Like a big problem that we all deal with sometimes, some more than others, is procrastination. And that's kind of like a mild form of disassociation. Like, I don't need to do that today. I can do it tomorrow, when like the reality is you really need to do it today. And if you do it every day, it's like a mild dissociation. And then another one that I think we deal with like everybody does sometimes is going through grief and loss, whether that's a relationship or a death. And you mentioned that a little bit earlier, how there's a healthy way to do it, and if we're not careful, we can do like go into certain parts of it too much. So we all kind of do on some level, I guess, but just maybe not to the clinical way that it's like a huge psychological problem.
Yeah. So when it comes to procrastination, I don't think that's dissociation per se, largely because there isn't an alteration in your understanding of reality. Not doing the work. Versus if someone were to actually dissociate and like completely blank out, that would be a severe alteration of reality. I don't know if they're both on the same spectrum. I don't remember seeing them two on the same spectrum. But I do know that it's hard. It's a hard thing to study because, again, like I said, no one comes in saying I'm dissociating. Please help me.
Right. Yeah. Another thing I want to touch on a little bit is just so this is kind of like the difference between consciousness and unconscious, but especially in the idea of ego seems very in the here and now, and which is very left brain, whereas the unconscious, maybe that's going on in sort of like our unconscious mind or our right brain, it can be more like throughout time, timeless in regard. And so it's almost like an animal is very in the here and now, right now. They don't really exactly have a concept of time, especially compared to how we've been able to interact with the concept of time so much. So it's like we're kind of dealing with our unconscious mind that has no idea about time, or our conscious, or they have these different concepts of time, and then they can come together, the conscious and unconscious, but it's going, when they come together, the conscious, unconscious, with the ego in that, it's it's uncomfortable for the ego. So it gives the ego that conflict, and maybe this touches on the idea of even procrastination. Because in our conscious minds we can be like, there's always more time to do that, and then maybe we kind of like justify it in our unconscious minds of like, just push that away, but then eventually it comes out and you have to deal with it. Okay, I have to whatever, pay this bill, go to work, study this, whatever. So what do you think of the ego's relationship to time, and how it can interact with the world that way?
So when I go back to the definition of the ego with Freud as mediating between the id and a superego,
sure,
the ego, when it interacts with the id, is interacting with something that wants instant gratification. Yeah. And that's where this time concept comes in. Like it seems to be trying to figure out right here, right now. However, when the ego is mediating with the superego, it's very aware of the super social structure that it's trying to behave under. In that case, it can actually be fairly timeless, so to speak, in your words overall. When we're talking about conscious versus unconscious, I always am very, very, very cautious when we're talking about conscious versus unconscious. And that's because if we were to just have a place of P negation P, right? Conscious and unconscious, we can then have a temptation of throwing everything in the unconscious, that which does not prove our theory. And that's why I'm very cautious about that. Because, if someone were to come to you and say, you're sad, and you're like, no, I'm not. It's, subconsciously you're sad. Yeah. Like, it didn't really help anything, didn't really do anything. Yeah. And so what you're really asking is, what you have to ask is, what is the relation of the self as it understands the conscious state? And what is the relation of the self as it relates to the unconscious state? And Jung seems to propose that the self is able to explore the unconscious to unravel things and put it into the conscious and then go into that space. Now, if that's the case, then what we have is something that can be empirically tested, that somebody takes the time to reflect on things they haven't thought about, and they uncover things that were hidden and underneath. And that can be proof of an unconscious place, or at least a subconscious place, or or a previously unknown part of an individual. And that's how I would say that's the relationship. But in terms of like a temporal relationship, I would say that's more likely related to an id versus a superego and gratification situation.
Well, because the id, ego, superego is basically Freud saying and to kind of like put it in down to earth, it's like the id is your primal instinctual drives, and the superego is, maybe it comes out as like a unconscious voice or unconscious interaction, but it's sort of like you might say it's like your higher self that tries to say, okay, don't just try to I know you want to poop now, but poop when you get to the toilet, or I know you want to have sex with that person, but have sex with them later, or in this setting. And then the ego is the one that kind of has to mediate between the two.
Let me explain how, in very simple terms, this is how
sure.
Okay? The id says, I want to have sex.
Right.
The superego says, I cannot have sex. Okay. And the ego says, how do I have sex? Right?
Yeah.
And that's how I kind of interact with each other. What ends up with this subconscious component is that as the ego mediates between the two, various subconscious dynamics may end up causing someone to behave in a way that is contradictory to their stated goals or their stated desires.
Sure. And this gets into a really complicated thing, which was talked about a little bit in this chapter, which is the issue and which is another confusing thing about what ego is and all of these things, is the issue of free will,
Ah,
which is a really tricky one.
yeah,
And I know that goes through psychology and religion for thousands of years.
yeah,
Um, but there's the aspect that you can say free will on an ego level exists in that you have a general, and this is sort of paraphrasing a part of
yeah.
the chapter, but you
Mhm.
have a general observable sensation of freedom, a sensation to choose
Mhm, mhm.
Coke over Pepsi. He mentioned in the
Yeah,
chapter.
yeah.
So you can observe that, but on the other hand, maybe even if you, however that much you want, and this is like an age-old debate, however
Yeah.
much you wanted to say, I chose Coke, not Pepsi, because I wanted to, there
Mhm,
was still all those influences that weren't exactly your ego influence, but they were, you
mhm,
know, handed down suggestions, some inherited and some from the culture and everything else.
mhm.
So with, I know that's a big complicated thing, but it does get into the what the ego is and maybe what the ego is not. So
Mhm.
how do we deal with the aspect of free will, especially in these aspects of what our ego consciousness is or isn't?
So this is the interesting part. Like free will issues have been plaguing us since the beginning of human thought, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do we have free will? Do we not have free will? And that's largely because we have this very uncomfortable relationship with society. Society tells us what to do, and we
Hmm.
do it, or we don't.
Hmm.
And as a result, we have this question about free will, which becomes very challenging. I don't think that psychiatry is all that equipped to answer the question about free will, because
Hmm.
psychiatry is really answering the question about the person and its relationship to the self and to others
Hmm.
to some extent, and then various pathologies and various cognition issues as well. Free will seems to be, first and foremost, a philosophical question
Hmm.
that explores all the different possibilities of different states.
Right.
But at the same time, we don't really have the benefit of repeating life again to see if we really had free will, right? We don't have that experimental ability to determine whether or not we have free will. The science sort of aspect of it.
And it's kind of a definition issue, and which
Mhm.
is something they talked about a little bit in this chapter, where by some definitions,
Mhm.
you, and it gets into this age-old debate, but by some
Mhm.
definitions, you can define people as having free will, and by
Mhm.
other definitions of the way that you define and look at something, you can say nobody has free will.
Yeah.
But the reality is, it's like so many other things in
Mhm.
this, is it's a combination of both,
Mhm.
that
But
we have a degree of free will and not. But go ahead.
yeah, so this is where religion comes into play to tell us what aspect of free will we have. Some
Mm-hmm.
are predestination, some say that God gives us free will, blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
But I personally rested on three main factors when it
Mm-hmm.
relates to free will.
Sure.
That as long as I have these three, I don't care about whether or not I have free will. And the first one is this distinction between free will versus astrology, right?
Hmm.
If astrology is telling me what I'm going to be doing, then as long as I have reasons for why I did what I did, and that I would do what I would do, even if astrology didn't exist, then to me that's good enough for free will. Even if astrology exists, I have reasons for why I do what I do. Okay, as long as I have a reason for why I do what I do,
Mm-hmm.
then in my view, it operates as if it were free will. Second
As
thing,
if, okay.
right? The second thing is I choose who I love and how I love them.
Hmm.
As long as I have the ability to choose that with the freedom of reason, then I am content because that is a very significant part of my relationship to a higher power, to God,
Sure.
who I love and who I choose to love. And finally, the third thing that I don't
Hmm.
want everyone taken away from me is I choose what I sacrifice. I choose what I give up. As long as I have those
Hmm.
two things, then as far as I'm concerned, I have free will sufficient to live my life happily and proactively. But whether or not I was predestined to have those things or whatever, that can't be tested, and I can't really
Mm-hmm.
create an experiment to test whether it's true or not. And at the end result, it doesn't really tell me anything because I still have to do things in life. I still have to function. So that's where I rest my personal free will debate, and I move on to read other things.
Yeah, what that makes me think of when you say that, and I don't know if this would be like a fourth or related thing to that,
Yeah, sure.
but it just something similar to what Viktor Frankl was saying in the book, is that he would see those who would basically lose their minds in these horrible concentration camp situations, and then others who would be able to find a way to stay strong. And he relates it to his logotherapy, or his giving life meaning. But that's basically that we always have a choice to and part of it goes into this age-old thing too, is that to some degree life is suffering, or that suffering is an inherent, unavoidable part of life. And just like happiness too, we're always going to have a level of suffering that'll go up and down, a level of happiness that'll go up and down, no matter what. Even if you're like in a concentration camp and you're happy because you got a potato or whatever, there's always going to be these ups and downs of happiness and suffering. But what he made the point, and this is a paraphrase, but he said you have the choice to give your suffering and or your happiness meaning. And so that gets into his thing of logotherapy, and that I think is what makes is what so much of this is about, is that even though we're going to go through those ups and downs in life, we can make them meaningful, and that makes life better, I guess. So I don't know if that and that does kind of get into the free will issue too, and what the ego position is that you see all these horrible things in life, or great things, whatever, because on the other hand, that's like a concentration camp situation. But on the other hand, there's people who are like have great lives, and then they end up being super depressed and sad, like physically great lives, or rich people, whatever. But it's what the person in their sort of like ego perspective chooses to do with the level of happiness or suffering that they have in their lives.
Yeah, so this choice of meaning, to me, is actually the second thing I mentioned, was a choice of love. Right? It's very hard for me to understand one meaning without understanding who one chooses to love. And this choice of meaning is very interesting in the sense that I've personally found that oftentimes we choose a meaning that's very much related to resolving the conflict we've experienced in our past.
Okay.
So if someone in their past suffered a lot of poverty, then their meaning in life will be to get themselves out of poverty.
Right.
If someone in the past suffered, let's say, abuse of parental stuff, the meaning will be undoing that abuse, right?
Sure.
Or perpetuating it, depending on whatever they want to do, right? And so what I found is that the most meaningful meaning seems to always have this psychological connection to what they've experienced in the past and conflict in the past, and resolving it, which then makes me wonder if we really choose our meaning or if we discover our meaning. And I personally think that we discover our meaning, but I do think that Frankl's correct that when we suffer, finding meaning within that suffering helps us endure the suffering.
Right.
But the sad part is that under the situation of the Nazi, camps, right?
Right.
Nazi, what do we call it? Concentration camps.
Yeah.
The suffering was placed onto them, as opposed to a risk that people take, or a consequence of risk that people naturally take.
Right.
So it's very different to be suffering because someone did that to you on a mass scale, and then you find meaning into it. And this is where atheists would have an opposition to it. It's like, you can find all the meaning you want in God, but at the end of the day, something bad happened. Like, something's got to change in that. Or so, like, it's, having solace in God during those very difficult times, it's ridiculous, because we should actually be more enraged and fight against them, and not just like be passive. It's a consolation prize that doesn't really bring us closer to being better versions of ourselves. We got shot on and took it. Like, that's.
I heard a story from William Shatner recently that I just found online. Yeah, but it's actually interesting, and it kind of, because I've thought of both perspectives on this, like, focusing on God in these situations definitely helps some people make it through. But so this William Shatner story that I'll try to briefly summarize, it almost gives light to the atheist perspective, but I don't know. I think but I would say that more than anything, just is how our minds work in this perspective that we're talking about. So anyway, this guy met William Shatner. This is like, I don't know, back in the 60s or 70s. And he said, I worked hard to become your driver so I could tell you this. And he said, Star Trek helped me survive Vietnam POW camp.
Really? Wow.
And how that happened was there were these Trekkies, they were calling them, or Trekkers, whatever, that ended up in this Vietnam POW camp at the same time. And this gets into our topic we touched on a little bit a few minutes ago of dissociation, of when that, and it's sort of what Frankl did sometimes and others, is one that they would, so what would happen in these this POW camp is they would be like rehearsing and trying to remember all the lines and playing out Star Trek episodes in these Vietnam POW camps, and it helped them to survive, and in this sort of like weird way. So what that is like, if the ego can disassociate from an abnormal oppressive thing that's upon you, it can be good. And then that, like, these people are able to reassimilate back in society in healthy ways, like Frankl and this guy, for as far as we know. But so, and from a atheist versus theological perspective, on one hand, you could say the Star Trek example shows like, oh, look, it's just your mind. On the other hand, maybe to a certain degree, but at the same time, sure, but it's because our minds have, for so many generations, millennia, however many thousands of years, who knows how long, we've been working in this way of relating ourselves to the world as a whole, including like what I talked about in a podcast a few weeks ago, God being the totality of all being, and that we are innately going to interact with the totality of all being and these superhuman powers, whether they are who we elevate as God or corporations or countries. You know, there are these superordinate forces at play, and that we're going to interact with these things, and that is just inside of us, and that's the way that our minds work, sure, but it works because we've had relationship with God for thousands and thousands of years. So I don't know, what do you think of this idea of how to deal with the world in this dramatic way, and how that might shed light onto the atheist versus theist debate?
So the biggest counter argument for the atheist with God is that God is just a coping mechanism that was necessary to help humans deal with the anxieties of life. That is the Freud sort of challenge against God existing. And I think that for a large part of humanity, God has largely been a coping mechanism for anxiety, for helping us give our daily bread, for fear that we don't get things. However, we've become wealthy, at least America is, but the entire globe, the entire world is becoming wealthier every day with globalization, increased production, GDP is going up, third world countries are becoming more modernized, and we as a human species is becoming more abundant. But if God used to be a coping mechanism to give us our daily bread, then what does God look like with abundance? The answer is apparently Joel Osteen, right? Or these mega churches, talking about with $100 million and jumbo jets and whatnot, a lot of scams along the way.
Right.
I believe that right now, this very second, human species does not have an answer for what does it mean to understand God in a world of abundance. And therefore, when God was a coping mechanism, it doesn't preclude that God doesn't exist. And just because we can have coping mechanisms and we understand the mechanism on a psychological basis doesn't preclude that God exists. But I do believe that there is a version of God that's outside of the coping mechanism, because God is greater than the coping mechanism.
Right. And
as a result, we have to discover that, or at least rediscover it and understand it fully to get to the next level of humanity. And that's what Shea-Arik PRL is all about, or at least it's trying to do, right?
Yeah.
And so you have this idea of God being, again, a coping mechanism. It helps us cope. It helps us handle things. It's very, very true. And the atheists saying, oh, it's just a coping mechanism. It's useless. it's in my view is very silly because God is more than that, but God of course would provide the tools of coping during someone's very difficult times. It's a bit like saying your parents don't
Mm.
exist because all they did was give you a candy bar, and clearly
Mhm.
there's a candy bar dispenser, therefore your parent is a candy bar dispenser. It's like,
Yeah.
no, when you grow up, you'll learn to have a better relationship with your parents than just a candy bar dispenser, right? But it's going to take some time.
Yeah, that's a whole tricky other Pandora's box sort of thing, because it's like,
Opening boxes all
did
right.
because it quickly gets circular,
Mhm.
especially as you get into the more theoretical aspects of it, of like, did we create God or did God create us,
Oh yeah.
or is it potentially both? Maybe in at least a theoretical understanding of the way that things have gone and are going,
Mhm.
we could theoretically, uh, we've already made like super intelligent ways of connecting the world through the internet and everything else, that we can just, like, right now we can so easily connect over Zoom calls and turn into podcasts and everything else, which is like a godlike act compared to what that they were able to do, even 100 or 200 years ago. But more and more so as we get into artificial intelligence, and some put that in a singularity theory of,
Mhm.
we do create God, and that then creates in a circular time
Yeah.
theoretical model of
Uh-huh.
creates. But the problem with these arguments is, it's kind of like you can theorize so many things, but in the end you kind of just have to say whatever it is, whether it's unconsciously invented coping mechanisms that had developed over thousands and thousands of years, or whatever the case is, it it works. But then also, if you're not careful, just be like, well, screw that, because we know there's not God. You immediately get sucked up into other coping mechanisms and other godlike things, like even uh corporations and countries. They're like these superhuman entities. They are higher powers, even though they're not one individual person that maybe you pray to and think of in that way, but they're higher powers, and that we interact with on that way. Sure, not like a necessarily like a spirit thing, like there's an angel of Google or United States or whatever, but we interact with it that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have to be careful with that, and I know it's a
Mhm.
lot of what your channel and my channel are about.
Yep.
um hmm. So cool, we've gotten all over the place, and I wanted to, and I know we're just about done, but you had a lot of notes and things. So is there anything else you wanted to cover before we start to wrap it up here in a couple minutes?
Not too much. I think it was a good conversation overall.
Mm-hmm.
Jung remains a very influential
Mm-hmm.
uh, person in the field of psychology, whether or
Mm-hmm.
not people disagree or agree with his theories and ideas.
Right.
It's fun. It's fun, going through the his thoughts and personality and ego and all the
Mm-hmm.
things.
Cool. I mean, anything else in particular, or do we find a way to, in one podcast, cover all the things that ego is and isn't?
I think we touched on fairly high level concepts
Okay.
so
Okay.
far. Yeah,
Cool.
we got the basics down and then we ran with it. And, the ego is a forever sort of exploration of how we understand ourselves.
Yeah, and of course, what I'm always trying to encourage people to do too is, get this book and other related materials, because um, I think what these conversations do is bring it more down to earth compared to just reading the book. Like, okay, yeah, sure, but
Mhm.
bring it more down to earth. But it helps to do both, and then engage in the conversation if anyone still
Yeah.
is confused on it, so they can reach us. And on that note, anything you have to add as far as finding your home on the internet and all that?
Well, I mean, you have my YouTube channel, Shay Arik PRL.
Mm-hmm.
You can also go to shayarikprl.com. I have a newsletter. If you like to
Oh yeah.
hear, all my crazy talk once a week, I
Yeah.
write up a nice article for people to read about psychiatry and religion and how
Mm-hmm.
it can help their life. So I've been, pretty consistent with it every single week. I have things out and I write it a month in advance, and it's growing. So, thank you very much for helping me with my growth and giving me the space to chat. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure. And then again, the reason, or one of the reasons that I originally reached out to Eric is because he did this series, or he's done a couple series that are really important. The Freud one, which is very popular on his channel, as well as the William James series, which is actually really helpful because that book is well, both those books are really tough, but it's really helpful, especially in sort of modern perspective. And these are these and it's really important too, just because it's so easy to be like, oh, that's unprovable or whatever, but the religious experience idea gets into like a lot of what we're talking about today too, is how that things are like on a subjective level, and that's a whole other thing of like subjective, intersubjective, transsubjective, and all the other things. So yeah, definitely check out Eric's channel, and if anyone is just tuning into this one, there is the other 8 chapters that we discuss, and definitely get the book, and there's some other books that we talk about, and then that's a good foundation for starting to get into some of these other things for people who are curious about it, and better ways to understand the world and the mind. So all right, Eric, thanks a lot. And we'll see you around, and hopefully we'll keep it alive and do this again every few weeks.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, thanks a lot. Stay archetypal and take care.
Yeah, you too.